Good evening. My name is Philip Bond, and I serve on the Board of Directors for the Filson Historical Society. Thank you for joining us both in person and virtually for tonight's program. Now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Andrew Feiler is a photographer, author, and fifth-generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Frank Brinkley earned 2 graduate degrees from Tennessee State University and Tuskegee University and taught high school math and science in his local public schools. Charles Brinkley Sr. earned a master's degree from Tennessee Tech University, taught middle school science, and served as a middle school principal. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Feiler, Frank Brinkley, and Charles Brinkley Sr.
Thank you all for coming out. It's great to be with you. I'm going to show a few photographs and set the stage before we welcome Frank and Charles to join me up here. I will start with 2 premises. The Rosenwald School's program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes the African-American experience. It dramatically reshapes America, and yet it is largely unknown, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. In addition, the collaboration between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause of civil rights. And there's a direct connection between the relationship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, the collaboration, the friendship. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, marching arm in arm in the front lines with Dr. King with his white beard flowing, and who famously says that when he marched with Dr. King, he felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia on January 5th, 2021, when filmmaker John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock crisscrossed the state of Georgia together for 2 months in a runoff. This is not a political statement, this is history. Developing not just a close political alliance, but a deep personal friendship. That relationship, and Georgia sends its first Jewish American and its first African American to the United States Senate. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. So I'm going to start with a photograph of a photograph. This is a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. Julius Rosenwald is born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, you will see this 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historic Site, and across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. It's the offices of the superintendent. Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he went down to research his biography on Julius Rosenwald, he met with the superintendent. He asked him, do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was? And he said, you're sitting in it. There was not a plaque out in front of that building at that time. At this time, now there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed there by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald Schools National Historical Park. And the vision of the campaign is a visitor center in Chicago next to where the Sears headquarters were when Julius Rosenwald was president of Sears, and Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 states. And the Rosenwald School in Tennessee that we'll be talking about tonight, the Cairo School, is one of the schools that would be in that National Historical Park. Legislation cleared Congress at the end of 2020, mandating that the Department of the Interior do a feasibility study. And when this happens, and I'm on the advisory board of the campaign, When this happens, and it will happen, this will be the first component of the U.S. National Park System to honor a Jewish American. Now, Julius Rosenwald rises to become president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. They didn't have the term CEO back then. And with innovations like satisfaction guaranteed or your money back, he helps turn Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what only later becomes known as civil rights. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in the president's home of what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington is born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founder of the historically Black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. This is a rare photograph of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. On the cover, you will see on the cover of my book is a photograph of the restored classroom inside the Pine Grove School, and in the back left-hand corner, you'll see this quilt hanging. These two men meet May 18th, 1911, so just over 110 years ago. And you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. At the end of the Great Migration, which is roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It's one of the largest internal displacements of people in human history. But in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And so these two men reach out to the Black communities of the South. And this is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School here in Jefferson County. This photograph, which is this is again a photograph of a photograph. This is from the Filson archives. I printed it from the digital, and those are my various, I read 41 books in the course of doing this project, along with about several hundred articles and 50 National Register nomination forms. Those are my books behind this photograph. They reach out to the Black communities across the South, communities just like this. And they say, if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution cash, land, material, or labor, because we want you to be full partners in your progress. And if you will reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate about creating Black-white dialogue as a vector for future progress, and these have to be public schools. So while we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. You do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now think about this. The Black community has to contribute. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants in philanthropic history. The white school system has to participate. This is an early example of public-private partnership. And from 1912, when the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama, is the first to raise the matching fund that will become the first Rosenwald School, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia, that's Warm Springs. This program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And the results are transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II. And the single greatest driver of that achievement is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. This is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama from about 1915, the early years of the program. They didn't keep exact records about dates, but it's the oldest, it is believed to be the oldest surviving Rosenwald school. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until I found myself at lunch in February of 2015 with an African-American preservationist named Jeannie Syriac, who had originated the role of African-American heritage specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I have been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? So I came home to my desk and I Googled it, and I found that while there were a number of history books on the topic, there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 survive. Only half of those have been restored. I shot 105 of the surviving schools, and the result is this book and this exhibition. There we go. So I want to just briefly talk about the architecture of these programs. But to do that, this is inside the Emory School. To talk about the architecture, I have to talk about Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. He's hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which the campus of which is itself a National Historical Site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor, including the Oaks, which was Booker T. Washington's home. And Booker T. Robert Robinson Taylor, who happens to be the great-great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in public policy circles in Chicago and a principal advisor to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House, Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects that lay out the architectural principles of the Rosenwald schools, these large banks of 9/9 pane windows on the left to let in lots of light, because these schoolhouses would not have originally had electricity. Cloakrooms on the right to keep dirty outer garments outside of the education spaces so the education spaces could be kept cleaner. Brick piers to vent the potbelly stoves that kept the schoolhouses warm on colder days. And you see about 2/3 of the way toward the end of this space, a room divider. That room divider would have originally had in it a series of doors that could be closed off to separate the education spaces or accordioned back to open up the unified space for use as a community center outside of education hours. These basic principles, which are laid out in 1912, by Robert Robinson Taylor and his team, persists throughout the entire history of the program. This is progressive era architecture in service to education. Now, note, this is what's known as a one-teacher school. This is the Jefferson Jacobs School. So as mentioned earlier, there's I'm doing a very short version of my talk. I'm going to be doing the long version of my talk on Friday, July 14th. And then on the July 15th, there is a tour of local area African-American schools, including the Jefferson Jacobs School. So this is what's known as a two-teacher school. Three-teacher school, this is the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Notice these are all small 1, 2, 3 teacher, small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Several of the members of the Little Rock Nine, who helped integrate Little Rock Central High, attended Dunbar, which is at Little Rock Central is only a mile from this school. And if this school looks vaguely familiar with its Art Deco architecture, it's because the architect of Dunbar was also the architect of Little Rock Central. Now, I knew this was an extraordinary story. I wasn't clear how to tell it photographically. And I originally started out doing exterior images. These 1-teacher schools, 2-teacher schools, 3-teacher schools. By the end of this program, you're dealing with 1, 2, and 3-story red brick building. It's a great narrative, But it's when I found out that half the schools had not been restored that I realized the adaptive reuse narrative and the historic preservation narrative was an essential part of this story. And that meant I had to get inside, and that meant I suddenly needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, and I bring their stories into this broader narrative with portraits. This is Mildred Estelle Ridgely Gray, the Ridgely School in Maryland. Ms. Gray's mother donated the 2 acres of land for this school. She was a student in this school. Her teacher was her eldest sister. She went off to college. She came back and taught in this school, found that she had an interest and knack for special needs, went off to NYU and got a graduate school in special needs, came back and found that this school had been turned into a special needs special school, and she became the principal in this school. And I will add that when I shot this portrait in 2019, she was 98 years old. I was on the road having opened an exhibition in Charleston, South Carolina, the work of my previous book. And I got a call from her daughter that Ms. Gray had passed away. And could they please use this photograph in the funeral program, which of course I was very happy to oblige. And when this exhibition that you see here today premiered at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, her daughter came down to the opening. And these are the Brinkley brothers, Charles and Frank Brinkley, who we're pleased to have with us today. I just want to tell a brief story about two brief stories about this school, and then we'll welcome Charles and Frank to the podium. First of all, this portrait of Julius Rosenwald inside the Cairo School, this is in Sumner County, Tennessee, a one-teacher school, has hung, this photograph of Julius Rosenwald is hung in that spot since this schoolhouse opened in 1923. Meanwhile, I want to tell you this story of Jeannie Syriac, who's the preservationist that first told me about Rosenwald schools, scoffed at the idea that when I was out doing my research, I had the internet. Jeannie went crisscrossing across the state of Georgia to identify 37 surviving Rosenwald schools before the internet and had them collectively listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So to give you an idea of how my research process worked, this is a particular model of Rosenwald School known as the Plan 1A. And it's a very common model of the Rosenwald schools. And I didn't have a 1A yet. And I needed to shoot one. And I found this photograph of this schoolhouse under restoration with one of those signs out front that has the name of everybody involved. And I called the architect. I explained to him what I was doing and that I wanted to get inside the Cairo School to do a photograph inside the schoolhouse. And he said to me, "You need to talk to Frank and Charles Brinkley." And that is how I met Frank and Charles Brinkley. And so let me welcome to the stage Frank and Charles Brinkley, and we'll continue our conversation. So in case there's any doubt, this is Frank on the right, Charles on the left, and I'll spare them the agony of having to tell you that Frank is the older brother. You will see that in how they interact. So gentlemen, let me start with a question tell us about your parents and how they approached your education as kids.
Our father was a
Frank, pull your mic.
Let me first of all thank you for being here today, and thank all of you all for coming, of course. My father was the principal of one-room school in Cairo, Tennessee. He was a graduate of Tennessee State University, and he was what we call a 550 vet. After he came out of World War II, he went back to school, and of course, they got a little check, stipend. And but he had insisted from birth that all of his children would go to college. And from the time that I could spell my name, he always insisted or let us know that we would be going to college. And he talked about how important it was for Black men and women to have college educations. He felt that this was the only thing or the only way he could survive during the time that he was in school. He worked in the 8th grade, I believe. He came to Gallatin from out in the country, and he worked for a white family whose name was Doolins, D-U-L-I-N, get that spelled right. That's my middle name. And he worked for those folks, and they insisted. One of the stories that I tell very often is that when he first went to work and he was getting an interview, they told him that two of the things he had to do, it was go to church and go to school. And he got an associate degree from Tennessee State University and came home and pitched it on the table and told the lady, Mrs. Doolin, I finished school. She picked it up and said, Hush, what is this? This is not a diploma. This is not this is no good. He said, that's all I can get. She said, no, you take this. And that very next week, she drove him right back to Nashville to school and enrolled him to finish school. And he tells that story with a lot of pride. And I think from that time on, we always felt the 6 of us, 2 boys and 4 girls. And he insisted that you stay in school and you graduate. So I've just always felt, and I think the entire family did, all 6 of us, felt that we didn't have much choice but to attend college.
Charles, what would you like to add to that?
If you want me to add to it, just a little more to add to it. It reflected on me when he said about church. A lady asked me today, how did it feel? How was I involved with him being my father? He being the school principal and the teacher. I told her that it was like the creator and the maker of us. He's a Trinity. He's 3 in one person. He's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So we had no other choice than how he felt to reflect that on us. And it was just amazing. And the things that we did, matter of fact, our family, to add to think what he was saying a while ago, all 6 of us did go to college and receive degrees. And what's so ironically, we all married school teachers except one, and all of us were school teachers.
And let me just, I'm going to add here. All 4 children went to college. Excuse me, all 6 children went to college. These 6 children have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. This legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. So Charles, let me start with you. Bring us into this schoolhouse. What was your day like? What was it like to go to school there?
A typical day at Cairo School was a school that was outside city limits in a community called Cairo, Tennessee. My father was principal, as you know. We left the city and went to the country, okay? We did not have basketball goals and these kind of things for recreation. And there was 8 classes in one school building with one teacher, okay? 1 through 8th grades. My father let me order the milk. And during that time, that was in the early 50s, our food was provided by the community. They grew the sweet potatoes and the cabbage and the cook made cornbread and so forth. And we would have classes and smelling the food at the same time because of the one building. It just a foot from one another, you know. And well, I had to act right, you know. And I would call Kristen Hill Milk Service to order the milk. It was about like 28 students during that particular time. And during the early 50s, we didn't have 2 telephone numbers to call. You just pick up the telephone and say 72. And that was I should never forget that number. 72, only 2 numbers to call somewhere else. And the person would pick up and say, Christian milk service. And I would say 24 to 28 half pints of milk for Cairo School, and hang up. We didn't have a conversation. We didn't talk. They set the milk on the outside, and we drove to school and picked up 4 or 5 other people within a 50 Fleet Line Chevrolet, 2 doors. Of course, the seatbelt law was not in, it wasn't active during that time. We was overcrowded. We had to carry milk with us and stop and pick up kids, and you couldn't hardly see over the windshield because the car was so full of people. But our father got there, and we opened up a school day with, actually we had prayer and devotion before every morning when we went into school. But the teaching was different after I learned compared to the city schools, because I thought I was supposed to do what I was supposed to do when I was supposed to do it like I was supposed to do it. And it was a little different after I found out, but it was a good experience for me to know.
Frank, you want to add to that?
Yeah, our father was a strict disciplinarian. And if he told you to do something, you didn't dare even think about it. You just did it. Do as you're told to do, when you're told to do it, and do it cheerfully. So we were pretty well acclimated to knowing how to act and how to do. In fact, some of our high school teachers were impressed with how well we were disciplined, so far as being obedient and respectable. And our father, as Charles said earlier, we had 8 classes in a 1-room schoolroom with about 25 or 30 students, some in every grade. However, many times he would put classes together. And one of the big advantages that I had is that if there was a math or science class being taught, I listened to every class. Even though I may have been in the 1st grade, I'm into the 8th graders too. And I was telling a story once, I believe, about, I talked to my sister about this. She said I was in the 8th grade, but I think I was in the 7th. But that summer, I was becoming an 8th grader. I got the 8th grade math book, and I worked every problem in the book, but she said I worked all the odd number problems in the book because they had the answers to the odd numbers. And she said, don't say you worked all of them, just the odd numbers. So I'll take that back to correct that. They were all the odd number problems. But there was something that I really enjoyed about numbers. And even today at 82 years old, I can recall numbers just kind of instantaneously. But I received a National Science Foundation academic scholarship to Tuskegee Institute back in 1968. And I learned quite a bit about Booker T and his crew, because they had a orientation program where they really stress knowing the institution. Back then it was called Tuskegee Institute. And I stayed there for 1 academic year and enjoyed it. But so far as Cairo was concerned, I think the advantage that we had to hear all the classes, and that was a big advantage for most of us.
So let me stay with Cairo School for another minute. Talk to us about the curriculum. What curriculum did you cover with these 8 classes in one small schoolhouse?
Yes, we had science, math, social studies, English and math every day. He loved his English and math because he thought those were 2 of the core courses that everybody had to understand. But the story I want to tell is that my father would give a little test to kids when they first got there. Some would just be 5 years old. And he would classify those kids as kindergarten, pre-kindergarten, first grade, second grade, etc. But if you couldn't read, he'd hold you back. And some of the kids were 9 and 10 years old before they ever got to first grade. And when they left at 8th grade, they were, I don't want to exaggerate, but they were pretty old kids. But one advantage was that he always used some of his students to teach others. So I always enjoyed doing that. That's one reason I always thought that I might be a pretty good school teacher, is because I enjoyed the kids. And when I was in the 5th or 6th grade, they had a problem on the board, and I was telling my dad that it was not right. And so one of the students said, "Well, we got the answer." I said, "You may have gotten, that problem is not right." So he sat down and he wrote a letter to the Macmillan Book Company about that. And we got a letter a few weeks later acknowledging that I was right. So I bragged about that for a while. But I think that the curriculum was fairly comprehensive. It had a little of everything. And I used to enjoy social studies because we would talk about current events. I started school in 1947. That's just a couple of years after World War II. Some of y'all don't know anything about World War II, but it was a pretty rugged war. My father served in that war, and he came home. He had both of his legs broken. Big Red Cross van brought him home, and my mother had just had her 5th child, Anitha, had a 5th child, and she was screaming and hollering. And I donated very generously to the Red Cross for years, just because it brought my daddy home from the war. And he believed that everything that is done for a purpose. He would not tell a lot of the stories, war stories, because some of them were fairly gruesome, he said. And he was in the medics, and he said it was no fun, and he just never really want to talk about it. He said if he could have done it all over, he probably would have gotten some counsel for that. And I think they do that now to you young men. They do that now. But so far as the curriculum was concerned, it was something that he started out with the older kids in the morning, and he went all the way down to the first graders. Occasionally we'd use 8th graders or 7th graders to read or to do math with the younger group. And that was a fascination of my day.
So Charles, talk to us about how you went from to college, decision you made to go to become an educator, graduate school. How did you make that transition into being an educator?
I learned it through experience and listening to my father. You know, to be frank, I did not want to go to college because in high school, I scored one of the highest numbers on the test, and I was going in the United States Air Force. And I came back and I was really proud about it. And I told him, I told my father, I said, I scored really high on the exam today, and I'm going to the Air Force. And he said, "No, you won't be going to the Air Force. You're going to Mississippi Valley." That's where we went to school, you know. And he said, "Well, you going to school?" I said, "But I think you go to school in the Army." I had a friend that go to Tennessee State University, and you know, he had gone and ranked up, and he went into second lieutenant and everything. I said, "Well, I can do the same thing." That's what I thought I could do. Well, my father said, "Nah, you going on to college." So like I told you, the Trinity, I didn't have no choice but, you know, to go to school. So after I got to studying, it really got interesting, because I really, like I said, come to myself, and I've done a lot of things. I was sort of a community leader. One time I was talking to the kids at school, and they was asking me, they really thought I was really smart, but I just had experience, and they said, well, how did you rank in school? Were you an honor student too? I said, yeah, I was an honor student. I was ranked number 3 in my class. I was 30 from the bottom, they didn't, but higher care of myself. And when I did, I went on to get a couple of more degrees and plus 45, and I enjoyed my college life so much. And I became a principal, and I just learned a lot as I went along.
So Frank, you were teaching your fellow students when you were in 5th grade. When did you decide to become an educator?
I think that I thought that I may have been that all the time. I did not really care that much about being in a classroom all day. I kind of want to be in a laboratory, in a science laboratory, doing some things. In fact, when I first left college, I went to somewhere in North Carolina to a chemical corporation to work. And my wife, who's back there, by the way, is a native Mississippian. Our father's best friend was the president at Mississippi Valley. That's how we ended up at Mississippi Valley. Dr. White was a native of Gallatin, Tennessee, and they were good friends. So he told him that he was going to send all 6 of his children, because he didn't have 3 at the time, but we're going to send all my children. But he always knew he was going to have 6 children. He said when he get 6 children, he's going to stop. He wanted half a dozen children, and God blessed him with that. And we had the opportunity to experience a lot of classroom situations. So I was at Tuskegee Institute, and I was one of the, I don't know what we would call, but in our practice sessions or study sessions with this little study hall that we would go to. And every day I would go in, and whatever we'd done in class that day, I would go over it with about 4 of my colleagues. And I got to enjoying it. And they would brag on, man, you get this. And I started enjoying it quite a bit. And so I may have really always thought I was going to be in education or a school teacher, but I stayed in education 37 years, and I think I've enjoyed most of it. Yeah.
So let's talk briefly about the Cairo School itself. I showed the picture of the interior, but describe the schoolhouse to the folks here, both the inside and the outside.
It wasn't such a big building. It just had one teacher, like it was noted. You all heard the term cloakroom, didn't you? We didn't have an indoor facility to work with, but we used to put our books and things in what we call the cloakroom, and it wasn't such a large school. If you want to, 300 square feet probably, and had upstairs kind of steps you go up to where the lady were cooking, and they had sliding doors that separated the classroom from the kitchen. And like I said, we down there smelling the food while it was cooking, and you really had to concentrate. We had to concentrate because you can either listen to the teacher or smell the food. And we were doing, some of us doing this same thing, doing both of them. But the school physically size wasn't that big.
So when the schoolhouse closes, it falls into some disrepair, right? And y'all were involved in the restoration of the schoolhouse. So tell us about how that movement came together in your community.
We'd taken some pictures. And again, my wife is probably one who needs to get credit for this. she had written a grant for some restoration for the building. It was being used as a community center. It closed in 1959. And as Charles was saying, it just only had 2 sections, but it had cloakrooms, a boys' cloakroom and a girls' cloakroom. The toilets were on the outside, boys in the far back, girls in the far right, back out in the woods, and separated from each other. And we had reset periods that I forgot to mention earlier about the curriculum, where we did our physical activities. And the teacher would come out and ring a bell. Everybody would come in, and he'd have a clock that he would set. And in 5 minutes, you had to be in there and in your seat. If you were not, he had what was called a black rider strap. And he'd always use us on examples. So they know if a man can do his child that way, what he would do to them. So he didn't have much of a discipline problem at all. But my wife was probably responsible for the total restoration of that school. And what they did, they came out and did a new underpinning, because the foundation was very important. But the school also had what was called a cellar. So they would take fruits and vegetables and put down in the cellar. Very cool down there with clay walls. And you could dig holes in the clay wall and put fruit jars. And I mean, it lasts forever, I guess. Someone asked me about going down there, and I told them I think I'd rather not go in there, because maybe bears living in there. I wouldn't take a chance on going in that place. But the school building itself was, Velma may can tell you what the size. I don't know, but it was just a small building. It looked a lot larger when we were there than when we go back now. But all of the windows were on the west side, where the sun would come in the daylight to warm the school. There's a warm morning heater, wood stove, and a cold stove that sat over in the corner. And that thing would get hot, turn solid red. And we were not allowed to go anywhere near it. And that's what kept one of the residents who lived in Cairo would come every morning in the winter and make a fire. When we get there at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, it was warm and nice. My father would pick up kids on the way to school, because the county, the state, I guess, required that you have a certain number of students in school each day. So to accommodate that, he had to take children from in Gallatin area and bring them out to the country. And we talk about that now. Of course, most of them are dead, but we talk about it now. We have a bunch of fun talking about Cairo School and how we had to. Now, some days we would walk just for fun. There was no buses to take us. We would walk to school and walk back to school. And I tell everybody, it was 5 miles to school, 5 miles uphill going, 5 miles uphill coming back. Never any downhill travel. But we enjoyed it. It was fun. We enjoyed it. We look back on it now and figure it was truly a blessing to have been to one of those Rosenwald schools.
And one of the other outlooks, the floor was made of big log woods. You didn't mop and sweep, so to speak, like they do now, and mop the floor and clean it. You put oil on it. And out of all those years, I was there about like 8 years. No student ever failed. We never had emergency where we had to leave. He had to leave to take somebody to the hospital or the doctor or nobody. It wasn't any fights out there way that hurt that he had to leave or call a parent, because a parent had just as much right to correct us as anybody, you know. So he would tell us, like we talking about his discipline. A person asked me, I said, well, how do you get along? When did he ever have to leave? Or did he have to come to to take somebody somewhere. Did anybody, students get sick like they do in schools now? And the parents come and get them early and do these, like y'all do. Come and pick them up from school. You say they got a doctor's appointment. But anyway, when I left to go to high school, he told me in early 50s, I graduated from high school in 1960s. 2 years after that, Cairo School closed. You know what he told me when I stayed in town to go to high school? He said, do not have me to have to leave his school to come see about you in problem. And he never did have to come. He should have came, but he didn't. He didn't.
Frank and Charles Brinkley.
Thank you.
Before we take questions, let me introduce Frank's wife, Velma, if you'll stand up, please, who wrote, as Frank said, wrote the grant that helped save the Cairo School. And Gloria, Charles's wife. Okay, we're happy to take questions. Microphone's in the middle here.
Absolutely. If anybody does have questions, come up and use this microphone, especially so our folks who are watching online can hear. So please come on up. I would love to invite you all up and talk about being part of this story. Talk about that grant writing process and that historic preservation process. I'd love to hear more from y'all about that.
One thing I want to say. Only one thing that I want to say is he has had 6 children. He had one every year. They would wham, wham, right down the line until he got ready to go to the Navy. And he came back and got the last one and he had his 6.
I am a local historian. I have written 6 books on local history. And of course, I am a trained grant writer as well, but I've retired from grant writing. And currently I'm in the process of establishing a museum in the Rosenwald High School building that still stands and is being used as Shalom Zone. So at any rate, for the Cairo Rosenwald School, the money for the restoration came from a grant from the Lowe's Foundation. A description of the school would be that it is about between 10 and 1,100 square feet. It sits on a solid rock foundation, and that was one of the most important things that had to be done. The school was lifted off of its old foundation because the rocks had begun to cave in. And of course, underneath that was the cellar. I shall never forget their father had me as his driver because I was retired and so was Daddy. And I would drive him every place he wanted to go. And one day he said, "Velma, drive me out to Cairo Rosenwald School." So I did. He says, "Velma, let's go down in the cellar." Because when I was here 20-something years ago, I left a half crate of cheese in the cellar. I said, "No, I can take you to any grocery store in Middle Tennessee to buy cheese, but in the cellar, we shall not go." At any rate, it was quite interesting when they lifted the building and kept it lifted for quite a while until they recreated a strong rock foundation before lowering the school down. And another thing that I find so interesting is the windows. All Rosenwald schools, as well as Rosenwald lookalikes, have 9/9 hung windows. And according to the stipulations, the schools had to face either the north or the south. That was because they had no electricity. And therefore, the school had to be built in such a way as to have natural light in those 9/9 hung windows. And those windows really gave us a fit because they had to be taken out painstakingly, well padded, carted off into Nashville, and re-glazed, which was an expensive process. And of course, only one company was capable of doing the re-glazing. So that was probably the most difficult part of it all. And in each of those schools was a pot-bellied stove. And our stove disappeared about 22 years ago. I have a suspicion where it disappeared too, but that's neither here nor there. All I know is that it is gone. And the cellar was used by the cook at that particular school to store canned jars of food for the winter months for the students, because she had to cook, and she was a volunteer of all the jobs to have on a volunteer basis, serving as a school cook. God bless her soul, wherever she might be at this time. But at any rate, occasionally, one of their friends, Lester May Hill, said she remembers vividly when the cook was out, that Dad, their father, had to teach 8 grades, all of the classes for each grade, in addition to cooking dinner. And she says on one occasion, Daddy was peeling potatoes and someone was misbehaving in the classroom. And she remembers him pushing that sliding door that Charles alluded to, pushing that door back. And she said Dad was not conscious of what he had in his hand. He had a long knife. And she says that he was waving that butcher knife. Sammy Joe, one more word out of you and I shall get you. Well, Sammy Joe thought he meant, I'll get you with the knife. When he meant, I shall put the knife down and come and thank you. So at any rate, Sammy Joe, as well as all the other kids, behaved for the rest of that day. Are there any questions? If not, thank you.
We've got a question that came in from one of our staff members, Alana, who's watching online. How would someone go about researching if they think they might have a family member, community member who attended a Rosenwald school? What resources, what research paths should they go on?
Well, one of the gratifying components of this project has been all the conversations that it has started. On the very first event when this book came out, we were still in the middle of the pandemic. This is April of 2021, and I was interviewed on a virtual stage by former Atlanta Mayor Shirley Franklin. And Shirley texted me the next day that some of her friends had been watching, and they started these conversations in their families and realized that they had relatives that had been to Rosenwald schools, because she's the first generation had to help raise the funds that contributed to these schools. But these schools were in service for many generations. In fact, in the case of John Lewis, for example, his parents went to the Rosenwald school that he attended. But by the time you get to the second and the third generation, that connection to Julius Rosenwald and to Booker T. Washington is often been lost. And so it's been really gratifying to see these people's, in fact, Brent Leggs, who heads up the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, wrote the afterword to my book. Brent grew up in Paducah, Kentucky. And he went to graduate school in historic preservation, and he did his graduate school thesis on Rosenwald schools in Kentucky. And only when he got into that did he find that, completely unbeknownst to him previously, both of his parents went to Rosenwald School. So the portrait of Brent in the book, it was a pouring rainy day, and he's got a black umbrella standing in the rain on the lot where the Rosenwald School, attended by his father, previously stood. Now, to more specifically answer your question, the Rosenwald Fund was, the Rosenwald Schools program was run out of Nashville for the middle chunk of its time. Program begins in 1912. All but one school is built before 19. Basically, the program largely ends in 1932, except for one school, which comes 5 years later. And from 1920 to 1928, it was in Nashville. And as a result, the archives of the Rosenwald Fund are at Fisk University. Now, when I was doing this research, there was an online database where you could go in and search by county, by state and by county, which Rosenwald schools may have been in the county that you grew up in or you had relatives in. And they had gotten a grant from, I believe, the National Trust for Historic Preservation to digitize those records. They now have a new grant to digitize all of their records. And while that digitization process is going on, unfortunately, that online database is offline. And I'm not sure exactly when it's coming back, but it will be back at some point in the near future. And that's a wonderful resource for researching Rosenwald schools that may have been in your community and or in the places where your family has history.
Well, we're right at 7 o'clock, and I know we want to get folks back home. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And we have copies of the book over here for sale. Please go pick one up and have that signed by Andrew and the Brinkleys. What an opportunity to have those folks with us tonight. Thank you so much.